Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's webinar of the PyroLife International Symposium. My name is Simona Dossi and I will be moderating today's webinar along with Mario Tapia and Nimura Busama. We are all PyroLife early stage researchers. PyroLife is a research collective aimed to train future experts able to provide the highly necessary understanding of wildfire in its global, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and transdisciplinary context in both traditionally fire-prone countries and non-traditionally fire-prone countries. PyroLife is funded by the prestigious Marie Curie Action within the European Horizon 2020 program. We're so excited about the symposium's success. We've had more than 400 people register from all over the world, and we're so excited for everyone to join. I will quickly explain how this webinar will work. We have two amazing speakers today, Lisa Langer and Vanessa Cavanaugh, and they will both present, and right after their presentation, there will be a quick question and answer session. All of the participants' audio and video are disabled, but you can ask any question you want by typing it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And Mario and Nimur will be selecting questions throughout the presentations, and then we can ask the presenters your questions. Because inclusivity and diversity are very important to PyroLife, we encourage you to ask your questions in whichever language you're more comfortable with, and we will do our best on our side to translate them. All webinars are recorded and available within 1 week after the webinar online, either on the Symposium webpage or on the PyroLife YouTube channel. Please feel free to share your experience of the Symposium on social media by using the hashtag PyroLife Symposium or hashtag PyroLife Webinars. We really appreciate all the help in spreading the word about the Symposium and about integrated fire management. So without further ado, I'm so excited to present our first presenter. Lisa Langer has led social wildfire research within the Scion Rural Fire Research Group since 2013. She has undertaken extensive qualitative research, principally focusing on wildfire-affected community resilience, Maori use of fire, and effective wildfire communication and mitigation measures to reduce wildfire risk to communities within New Zealand. Today, she will be talking to us about integrated fire management in Aotearoa, New Zealand, drawing on social and cultural research with rural and rural-urban interface communities. Hello, Lisa.
Kia ora. I'll just start by sharing my screen. Has that come through now so you can share, see the slide presentation?
Yes, we can see it without the notes now. Thank you.
Oh, sure. Thank you. Ki te mana whenua tēnā kutu. Ko Lisa Langer tōku inga. Ko Ngāti Aotearoa te iwi. Ko Scion tōku wahi mahi. No rea tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. My name's Lisa Langer. I work as a social scientist, a senior scientist for Scion. Scion is actually the trading name of our organisation, which is formerly the New Zealand Forest Research Institute, and it's a Crown-based research institute. I just, in terms of my introduction, I certainly have been working in the wildfire social research space for around 17 years, and I'm very appreciative to have the opportunity to present. But I really like to acknowledge my collaborators, but most particularly my team members within the Rural Fire Research Group that we have here at Scion. So what I'm presenting today is not just all my own research, and I really like to give them credit for that. Just one other explanation is that I am using the terminology rural-urban interface, or the abbreviation RUI. Please see that as totally synonymous with wildland-urban interface. So to give you a little bit of context in terms of Aotearoa, New Zealand, we're a small country, a small population. We've just reached the 5 million mark. In the order of 16% of our population are indigenous Maori. In terms of land area, we're slightly larger than the UK. We're a temperate climate, and we were started off as a primary rural community, but we've got increasing urbanisation. Now, without going into great detail, I think it's worth me providing a little brief history just to set the context. Maori are known to have arrived in Aotearoa, New Zealand from eastern Polynesia by waka or canoe in the 13th century. In terms of European settlement, first we have the Dutch explorer Abel Tasman in the 17th century, in the middle of the 17th century. He didn't actually go ashore, but he did have an encounter with Maori. And this wasn't followed until 1769 when James Cook landed and began European colonization. And I suppose the rest is history in terms of purchasing land at extremely low prices. There were wars, and there was significant loss of Maori land, and certainly a huge impact on lives, language, their culture, and ongoing opportunities. On the image there is our founding document, the Treaty of Waitangi, signed by Maori chiefs and the British Crown in 1840. There are two versions, the Maori Te Reo version and the English version, and they are not a direct translation. And there is obviously a lot of study as to exactly the meaning thereof. And in 1975, a tribunal was set up to try and redress and provide compensation for land that was taken, and that's still ongoing for our tribes or iwi. So in terms of forest, we used to be a very forested nation. We started off prior to settlement with in the order of 85% forest cover. By the time the treaty was signed, it was considerably reduced. And this was a combination of Maori and European. Presently, we have in the order of 23% land cover of indigenous forest, and alongside that, a little over 2 million hectares of plantation, primarily radiata pine. So wildfires today, I mean, the important thing too is a clear distinction from the rest of the world, as fire is not part of the our ecosystems in terms of it's not a natural part of our ecosystems, but it is used quite widely. We do like to use fire. We use it as a fire management tool, and it's used recreationally and for cultural purpose. So Maori still use fire for cooking on occasions, hangi under the ground, and it's certainly still used in that manner. But we do differ from the rest of the world. We have small and frequent fires. You can see there, you know, less than 4,500 fires on average a year, little over 5,500 hectares in total. And most of these wildfires are in grass or shrubland. So, you know, when you compare that with internationally, it is a huge difference. The other big difference is that our fires are primarily caused by human activity, and the pie graph there represents the known causes just in the last fire season, but in the order of over half of the wildfires are caused by either kind of escape burns from agricultural burning, cooking or recreational fires. But the picture is changing. If we look at this graph and just follow the general outlines, so the line of the blue line is the increasing number of wildfire in the rural-urban interface, and this graph goes up to 2018. You can see the increasing number of fires that have caused the loss of houses, damaged, and the number of homes that are evacuated. So the impacts on the community are increasing. This has been led by a number of quite significant recent fires. One is the Port Hills on the margin of Christchurch. This is actually my community, and for the first time I was evacuated. Actually, I should correct that. I self-evacuated because I decided it was time to go. It certainly was a big fire. It was a real education to the urban dwellers that thought that wildfires occurred in the rural landscape far away from cities. 9 houses were lost, others were damaged, and tragically a helicopter pilot also lost their life. This was followed a couple of years later in another fire close to a rural town, and the order of 3,000 people and also livestock, 700 farm animals had to be evacuated, and quite a considerable size of land burnt, including an area of nearly 2,000 hectares of plantation forest. There's been an even larger fire later in last year, though this was in Tussock grassland, but significantly too impact on the community because of its presence of a water reservoir. So again, impacting communities. And as we know, obviously worldwide, things are changing. We've got increased effects of climate change. We know, and we're doing further and further studies in terms of New Zealand will become hotter and drier, creating conditions that will increase the frequency and the severity of wildfires. We know this, and we're getting more detailed information for our regions, but you can see they're progressing from left to right in the increasing colour of the reds and decreasing colour of the green fire ratings. You can see the picture that is taking place. In terms of the agency that manages fire, we now have the Fire and Emergency New Zealand, which has brought together both the urban and rural fire services into an integrated organisation. They have a new act, and together the urban and rural needs of the country are addressed. And notably that in order of 85% of their personnel are volunteers coming from our communities. But the significant factor for me is not only bringing those together, but the changing manner of how the statement of intent and goals of the organisations have developed. It's really moved away from having a focus primarily on response, so putting out wildfires, to really trying to work with communities, a reduction focus, and trying to enhance community resilience. Which is really pleasing, and obviously where our research links to. So Fire and Emergency New Zealand, or FENZ as you may hear me refer to it, are our primary stakeholder, but they're not our only stakeholder. We work with other agencies such as the Department of Conservation, New Zealand Federated Farmers, Forest Owners Association, and we also provide our research findings not just in terms of peer-reviewed academic papers, but in terms of updates, summary forms, easy to read, and workshops. We do try and get our messages across in many ways. So looking more broadly at our team, and obviously I'm only giving you a snippet today, but to give you a little bit of background, the Rural Fire Research Group, which is based here in Christchurch, New Zealand, the primary research focus is preparing New Zealand for extreme wildfire. And it brings multidisciplinary research from fire behaviour and smoke modelling to fire technology development and the protection of treasured or taonga species in partnership with our not only Maori researchers but the communities that we're working with. The social and cultural research that I will focus on today has been part of this team since 2003. I can't find a team photo that includes us all, so I apologise, it's an old photo and very unusual to see me in fire gear, I might add. But we do have 6 scientists and 4 technicians. Were led by Dr. Tara Strand, and then we have quite a few other Scion researchers, including our Maori researcher, working with us, but also collaborators from the US, Canada, Australia, and other parts of New Zealand. And in line with the PyroLife diversity theme, I thought I would add that we've calculated it in order of the 65% of the research effort is actually performed by women in the group. So I thought that might be of interest. So focusing now on the social and cultural research, this is based on case studies that I've been part of. I haven't led them all, but I've very much foundation of our knowledge. But the focus has been very much on the rural and rural-urban interface communities, so people living on small properties, rural towns, and not within suburban settings. And as I will show in my presentation, that our research has broadened in more recent years, working in more of a natural hazard or a cross-hazard approach, and we have also studied a community in the Kaikoura district. This is this one here. You can see my pointer on the coast of the east coast of the South Island that experienced a huge earthquake in 2016. And also up here in the far north of New Zealand with a Maori community primarily affected by flooding and wildfires. The research we have done has spanned quite a few different dimensions, and I've just listed there some of the background of research that we have covered and studied over the years, from communication through to more recent research that we're performing in terms of adapting and mitigating wildfire risk due to climate change. So now, just to give you a kind of a snippet of some of our research, one piece of research, and I'd like to acknowledge Grace Aotearoa Stone, who led this research, where we looked at how Maori traditionally used fire. And I would like to just perhaps give you a couple of elements of that research. And one is looking at how mythology teaches us how Maori have understood fire and how it was brought to them, and without having the time to explain the story behind it. But essentially, the image you'll see there are a hand, and that Maui, one of our Maori gods, actually destroyed all but one of the fire children, represented there as the fingers, and it was just this one toiti that survived and became impersonated in the form of a native tree. And these stories are passed down through oral tradition. The myths are very much part of the dialogue of Maori communities. In terms of fire, if you reflect on that map where I showed the reduction of forest cover due to fire, and obviously Europeans played a large part in terms of removing forests and vegetation cover for settlement and for pasture, for farming, but also Maori were using fire at first, creating their own methods of creating fire by having a plough, and that's what the image there on the left is, rubbing for friction of the fire plough to create heat and on to fire. They carried smothering vegetation from one area to another, so they didn't have to start again each time. But they used certainly fire as a tool to clear land for cropping, for cooking, hunting, lighting, and pest control was amongst others. But it was also aided them to fell trees, hollow out trees to make their waka, their canoes, and to use wood for weapons and containers. So it was used, put to a diversity of use. It was their tool. Changing tack again, and I'm doing this quite repeatedly through the presentation. You recall I said that we only have a few small fires and small frequent fires. And you could say, well, you know, you think of the rest of the world with massive, you know, the bushfires of Australia, and you know, it's very much in the media in New Zealand as it is throughout the world. And you kind of think, well, what is in people's minds, what do they think when they think natural hazards? In the area in which I live, in the South Island, it's probably very much earthquakes. We've had repeated earthquakes, we've had damage, and there's a lot of efforts in terms of stabilising houses. Flooding is a big aspect of rural communities, snowstorms, volcanic eruptions, to a lesser extent tsunamis, but essentially we cover most natural hazards. So, you know, what about wildfire? What do people think? So we have looked at the awareness of our rural communities, and again, this has been very much set in the rural and rural-urban interface, so people on small properties bounded by rural land. Those that have experienced past wildfires do have quite a reasonable level of awareness of the high fire risk. We found that in a study, and here I'd like to acknowledge both Pam Jakes and, from USDA Forest Service, and Professor Tara McGee, who's worked with me from the University of Alberta and still works on ongoing projects. But looking at what has influenced people's understanding of awareness is that understanding of their local environment, their attachment to ancestral land for Maori, but also attachment for land of non-Maori, the guardians of the land, so the people that are really caring for the land, and the information that is passed down in the networks, social and community networks, but particularly within extended families for Maori. And then, as I said, those volunteer fire brigades are part of our communities, and so they too are a source of knowledge around awareness. But having awareness is one thing, but does it translate to preparedness? So, you know, we may know, oh, well, it's quite likely that we will be endangered by a wildfire or earthquake or flood, but do we do anything about it? And that's what it's really needs to be translated into action. And we have found that few have undertaken formal preparedness planning. There are informal plans that people put into place, whether it's to evacuate to a beach or and to make some forms of connections with their families following disasters. Some people do undertake measures such as providing a defensible space, so making sure that there's not a lot of vegetation close to their houses. But again, that's something that they need to prioritise against other, not only natural hazards, but also other priorities of biodiversity, aesthetics, and the like. And then just to think too, and is that not all communities are equal. We're not all in a position to purchase insurance. We don't all have the bank account that will mean that if our property is damaged or destroyed, that we will be able to build back or build back better. And I'm very cognizant of lower socioeconomic communities that don't necessarily have substantial houses and certainly aren't necessarily going to have insurance. So when a wildfire occurs, it can mean the loss of their entire property goes up in front of their eyes. Moving again, I mentioned the Port Hills fire on the edge of Christchurch. We are very interested. We realise that this is a new audience that has not been researched in the past. You can see here lifestyle properties, as we call them in New Zealand, in terms of properties on the there's small holdings, but those very much on the margins around the urban suburban areas. You know, so what do they know about wildfire? We haven't had the opportunity to do a detailed study, but we did do a study of national media and social media, and apparently it appeared that there was a very low wildfire risk awareness, and certainly preparedness was not on their radar. There was surprise that wildfire could reach urban neighbourhoods, and the expectation that Fire and Emergency New Zealand and other authorities will miraculously be able to prevent any fires endangering properties within the suburban areas. And obviously it's a testimony to their success of the past of being able to perform that function on a regular basis. But the reality is that we cannot leave it all to fire authorities. And that again, you know, the kind of the diversity of our communities, the socio-economic, the cultural, the demographics really mean that we cannot have an understanding of all communities from our few studies. Another piece of research is embedded in the Extreme Fire program, which I am not part of, but is a very much an integrated component of the program, and it's being performed by Waitangi Wood primarily, along with Uxa Pretorius from our team, and they are, and with other colleagues, excuse me, focusing on targeted protection to prevent extreme wildfire and protecting taonga or treasured species such as our little kiwi, which is our New Zealand icon. But looking at strategies of trying to reduce the likelihood of culturally significant values being damaged through wildfire. And so that's the real working with communities of trying to understand what they value, how wildfire and wildfires of the future could really impact on their culture and their assets, their sites. And that's ongoing research. Now, I mentioned that our research was broadening in terms of more of a natural hazards focus, and we have been working under the Resilience to Nature's Challenge, which is a funding source coming through from our government with a number of science challenges, and that the Resilience to Nature's challenges is based around the full variety of natural hazards within New Zealand. Within that, we have been working with the community in Kaikoura, so that's the area that was damaged by the 2016 earthquake, and I will give you a little bit of information of that. We have also been working up in the very far north with a Maori marae and looking at the effect of flooding and wildfire, but also how to future-proof with agencies to ensure they are protected as a community. There's a piece of work that we've been doing on both formal and informal volunteering, which is another whole story that I haven't got time to go into, and then the Port Hills research that I've already mentioned. So I'm really coming to my final area of exploration and description of the research that we've been performing, but the last one I'd like to give you just a little bit of an insight to is the Kaikoura Study, and here I really like to acknowledge Mari McCarthy, our Maori researcher, who has led this research. We focused on the Maori community and really looked at their indigenous knowledge and the manner in which they provided and cared for over 1,000 stranded tourists and also those displaced in the community without any assistance or plan with their local government. It was something they did. They opened the doors of this image here of their marae, Takahanga marae. They fed, they even gave crayfish to the visitors, which we'd done very well. But really what they did was they just demonstrated the value of their networks, their connection to the tribe of the South Island, Ngāi Tahu, Te Runanga o Ngāi Tahu, and their capacity to adapt. They didn't have stored food, they didn't have stored water, but hey, they did it. And their tribal economic and social systems that made it happen. So we have interviewed and run focus groups, and through Maori really identified some Maori cultural principles that allow us to understand community resilience and resistance through a Maori lens. So just to reflect on the that resilience and associated resistance is culturally empowering, transformative, concerned with cultural participation and cultural development, and above all, commands solid cultural leadership. And I think we have a lot to learn for the future. So I'm drawing to a close. I have tried to share with you some of our social and cultural research within this bigger context of our full research program of extreme fire in a very multidisciplinary and integrated process, but focusing on these elements that we've progressed from the rural and urban interface studies with fire affected communities to looking at more diverse communities, particularly those including Maori, looking through cross hazard, natural hazard effects on community, and now more recently the urban fringe. And this is where we're heading, is to really try and understand a little bit more about new subdivisions and planning in the process. But you'll see that we're very much linked to our stakeholders, our agencies. We see the area of the community networks and our Maori community as being all integral to our integration. So just finally like to acknowledge, as I said at the start, all those that have contributed to the research, primarily from the Scion Rural Fire Research Group, but also other collaborators, and all presentations need to acknowledge their funding source. So certainly the Resilience to Nature's Challenge funding and the funding both coming from the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, but also for the Preparing New Zealand for Extreme Fires, and our advisory committee that we work with closely. And please explore our websites if you want further information. So kia ora and thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. That was a really fascinating presentation. I thought it was really insightful to hear the role and the perception of wildfire in New Zealand, an area that I've never really been exposed to. I'd like to get started with this first question from...
Shall I just stop sharing? Would that help?
Yeah,
or
sure.
Would you prefer me to keep my presentation up? Stop the share?
Would you mind stop sharing so we can go full screen, please?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good.
So our first question is from Lazarus. He states that you mentioned some simulation models used regarding fire product spread. With regards to evacuation, do you use any of these simulation tools for preparedness or to test or validate evacuation procedures? Or would you consider looking into the use of such tools?
That's not my area of expertise, but I am aware at both the University of Canterbury and Massey University, they've been looking at evacuation, and they've done a study of the Pigeon Valley fire, so the one in Nelson, Tasman, of evacuation, and I cannot reliably say to the level of modelling that went into that, but I do know that there are discussions occurring with fire modelers and this team in terms of evacuations. So maybe some of it's occurring and maybe some of it will be more ongoing into the future, but very happy to provide some context of people who do understand that component of research, if that would be helpful.
Right. Thank you. And our next question is from Pooja, and she's wondering, to the extent of which information is available, how do the findings differ between ethnic and cultural groups across other regions of New Zealand?
I think that it's very hard to make generalizations, is that every conversation we have with a member of a community, within a community, is at one place and time. And I mean, I think that is something, a real takeaway message for us, is that you can do studies of communities, but it paints a picture and it gives you a piece in the puzzle in terms of learning, but it doesn't give you the entire takeaway finding to then be able to really replicate and use the same methods elsewhere. And I think that's why also it's very important as researchers that we work with our agencies who are working in the field. They know their communities, they work with these communities, they live in their communities, working with our volunteers within the fire brigades, because they are the real ones that understand their communities. In terms of Maori, we have different iwi or different tribes across the country, but even within one tribe you will never get a total picture of exactly what is appropriate for all circumstances or communities within that tribe.
Thank you. And our following question is from Andy Elliott, who says, "Hi Lisa, the history of
Andy.
the history of New Zealand has been fascinating. As a social scientist, have you considered how climate change will affect future land use, such as agricultural practice, plantation species and layout, possible loss of natural habitat and species, and town and county planning?
Well, there's a lot in there.
Yeah, it's quite loaded.
Yes. Climate change is, obviously COVID is our big focus at the moment, but climate change in New Zealand is really a focus, and in terms of adapting and mitigating, I believe strongly that we do need to make changes and learn and be forward thinking in all those manners in which Andy's identified. And I think that that is where challenges really lie. And I think the clarity in terms of some of the modelling is bringing perhaps a little bit more depth in terms of where those priorities perhaps need to lie, because it's hard to address, even in a small country, climate change without saying, well, where do we need to start? Where do we need to focus? We have some research that will soon be made, a paper will soon be presented in terms of understanding more within regions. So I think their mapping has gone down to 5 kilometre by 5 kilometre pixels or something to that level of really understanding on that kind of scale where priority geographically lie, but then obviously the ongoing aspects that Andy's mentioned in terms of needing focus.
Yeah, thank you. And our next question is from Bethany, who was hoping you could speak more about the oral traditions and histories of the Maori around fire, such as how they might shape contemporary local understanding of fire and risk awareness. And are there perhaps any community engagement efforts around risk awareness that use these Maori stories and histories?
Interesting, Bethany. Yes, stories do form a large part, and we've just taken on to the team a Maori researcher, Sylvia Tapuki, who has been also looking at waiata, so Maori songs in terms of the messages that are passed down through singing and the messages that they portray. So certainly ongoing. And I think it is an area that does need probably further study, and it's not one that I've particularly looked at, but I think that the other thing to say is that Māori do retain the protocols and the use of fire and the customs are still alive today. So as you saw me at the start of my presentation, I probably not very proficiently, but try to introduce myself in Te Reo. But we do go and we meet at marae. We work in partnership with Māori communities, and we sit together in their meeting house in their marae, and we understand. And a lot of that is based around learning that has been passed down, but is also current today. And I referred to the use of the hangi, which is underground cooking. That is something you're cooking for a crowd. You put down a hangi. It's the way they cook, it's pretty wonderful. So, lot to learn, but something to build on.
Yeah, absolutely. And our next question is from Karen Little, who says, "Kia ora, Lisa." Great presentation. Parts of New Zealand spend a lot of the year in a restricted or prohibited fire season. Do you think that current fire ban policies need better alignment with cultural use of fire for Maori, who historically use fire for land management, hangi, etc. throughout the year? And can we enable these and promote these traditional Maori use of fire in fire management?
Yes, I can't provide all the details, but as I understand it, perhaps I should backtrack as just to explain as has been identified in the question is that we do have a system of permitting and fire season which regulate the use of fire and obviously to protect communities and assets from fire. But the fire bans have on occasions, and I can't tell you across the whole country, but been acknowledging cultural use of fire even when there has been a fire ban. And to my knowledge, there have not been any accidental fires that have occurred, for instance, from a hangi. So because of those strong protocols, hangi are performed by the men. There's a gender difference. The women will prepare the food, but the men will supervise the hangi, and it is taught from the kumatua, the elders, to the young men. They learn how to do it safely, and generally that is acknowledged by the fire authorities. And there may be circumstances where it's not permitted, but I have heard of circumstances where it has been permitted, with even when a fire ban has been in place.
Okay, thank you. And our next question is from Bald Charlton, who asks, in a historically non-fire ecological landscape, how has the development of commercial pine and other plantations contributed to increasing the risk of unwanted fire and potential damage? And, as lead on, which grouping bears the economic cost of plantation land use and thus protection in terms of land use?
I'll start with the first bit first,
Yeah,
and you may have to remind me the
of course.
The second bit. Well, certainly the choice of plantation species has been flammable species. So radiata pine, we do have some eucalypts. So the flammability of plantations is I suppose, an issue. But I would say that the emphasis today, we do have a government too that is very keen on the planting and the encouragement of our native vegetation. We even have a 1 billion trees policy, which is around trying to encourage native planting. It does include exotic planting, but with climate change and carbon as its primary driver. But we do actually have a forest industry that on the whole are very mindful of not only their assets, but the flammability and the future of wildfires. They work very closely with FENS. They generally have their own fire crews. And I think that the policies that they undertake also are very mindful and cautious. They will, I certainly know some of my colleagues can't visit and do their work within a forest because it's considered the fire danger is too high. So through use of a chainsaw or even vehicles into a forest. So there are safeguards in place that ensure that we can have what is obviously quite an economic of importance to the GDP, the economics of our country, maintained in a more wildfire prone area and under climate change. And I've forgotten completely about the rest of the question. Is there more there that I should address? Or?
No, I think that covers it. I think that was great.
Okay,
yeah.
Thank you.
And no worries. And following that, our next question is from Judith Kirshner, who asks, thanks, Lisa, for this great talk. Do you think New Zealand implemented wildfire prevention successfully, also in government policies?
I think our government policies are definitely getting better. That's my opinion, but I suppose it's not just the policy, it's the implementation. And as I said, the government agency, Fire and Emergency Management, have a real commitment to building enhancing community resilience. But it's not an easy transition. It takes time, it takes resources, and obviously moving into climate change implications. So policies, I think, are moving in the right direction. I suspect we've still got further to go in terms of implementation, and also I'd say that the aspect of working with communities is still perhaps in its early developmental stages. So there's one thing to have a policy from an agency perspective, but if you're trying to actually do it together with your community rather than agencies putting in implementations for the community, if you understand what I'm trying to say is, if it's on a shared basis, it takes time and that goes back in terms of the awareness, the preparedness, the motivation of our communities to work with those agencies. So probably we need to reevaluate it somewhere down the track and ask that question again.
Thank you. And another question from Karen Little is, are there things local fire brigades and the FENZ could do to engage more with the Maori groups and promote knowledge sharing?
Yes, most definitely. And I think that it's happening slowly. FENZ is a relatively new organisation. It is pointing more Māori onto the staff to work with communities. The piece of research I referred to up in the far north that I didn't have time to present, we went and learnt from the community what their needs were, what their hazards were in terms of preparedness from their perspective, where we also brought them together with not only Fire and Emergency New Zealand, but another government agency, Civil Defence and Emergency Management, to work together to continue those conversations and to create plans together. So again, in its early stages, but I think the recognition of the cultural component is certainly seen, and I suppose too has been exemplified in terms of the Maori response to being the ones who've opened the doors to stranded visitors, locals, fed them, housed them, catered for their well-being, their needs, has actually been provided by indigenous communities rather than by welfare centres set up by our government agencies. So I think that real recognition of the need to do it together is certainly understood.
Thank you. That was the last end of our questioning. We'll now move on to, but thank you very much for your presentation. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you for your opportunity.
All right. Now we'll be moving on to our ESR introductions. And first off, we'll have Simona.
Hello again. I will quickly introduce myself and my PhD project. My name is Simona Dassi. I'm from Italy, but I am currently in London, United Kingdom, where my PhD will be based at Imperial College London. My background is in chemical engineering, but I am now based in Imperial's Mechanical Engineering Department within the HAZELab Research Group. I'm the PyroLife Early Stage Researcher number 7, and my PhD focuses on assessing the vulnerability of houses to wildfires in the European wildland-urban interface. I will be studying the typical building materials and building features of rural Mediterranean houses and analyzing their resilience to the wildfire threats of heat, embers, and smoke. I look forward to collaborating with NFPA and ITB Poland during my project, and I'm really excited to spend some time at both institutions during my secondments. And lastly, alongside the other 4 early stage researchers in PyroLife's work package 2, I will contribute to creating guidelines for FireWise Europe, an adaptation of the very successful FireWise USA voluntary program created by NFPA to help residents increase the ignition resistance of their community. Thank you very much.
Hi, hello everyone, and thank you for this opportunity to introduce myself to you all. My name is Riya Shah. I'm a transdisciplinary designer and artist with a background in architecture, landscape architecture, film animation, and curation. I'm from India, and I'm currently living in a small village north of Mumbai as I wait to travel to the Netherlands to begin my PhD at the Wageningen University. My PhD in landscape architecture will focus on the design of fire-resilient landscapes. In the summer of 2017, in between my master's program, I was in the jungles of Bilikirranga on a research grant, and I was introduced to fire as an agent of transformation and ecological preservation in the jungle by the indigenous Solega people. And this became the subject of my master's thesis and started my interest in fire. For my PhD, I seek to understand wildfire as a medium of healing and of regrowth from the fire-adapted human cultures of human and non-human cultures of Southern Europe. My project will combine this learning with lessons of resilience adapted from water-resilient design and participatory planning from the Netherlands in order to create or design a space for fire within its expanding territories. Like Simona, I will work with my colleagues from the work package 2 to create a set of guidelines that help communities build their resilience to wildfire and move towards landscapes that allow living with fire. And I'm going to do my secondments with Technosilva and the Forestry Commission in England to work on this PhD. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. You can't see me because of the technical issues with my camera right now. Thanks for joining in today. My name is Pooja Pandey, and I am from India, and I'm associated with PyroLife as one of the 15 PhD candidates, or you can say early stage researcher. And the topic of my research is European interagency exchange. And I'll be based in Cyprus, and my host institution is European University in Cyprus. And my secondments will be in Spain and Denmark with Frederiksberg and Technosilva. My project involves analyzing the barriers for European collaboration and exchange in emergency management. And for this reason, I'm going to be looking at the multi-level approach to study emergency management by the countries and the public sector governance system. And in the end, it would be helpful in strengthening the preparedness approach through interagency exchange. Just a little about my background now. I did my bachelor's in geography and my master's in GIS and another master's in river basin dynamics and management. And yeah, let's just get connected and share our views and thoughts through LinkedIn or Twitter. You can see our details, my details on the screen. And to know more about the ESRs or on the PyroLife project, you can always log into the PyroLife website. And yeah, I'm glad to be a part of such great project. Thank you. Have a nice day, all of you. Good evening.